Okay, hello. Let me just put streaming link on my Discord channel. Oh. Hello, people. Uh, so, where were we? Yeah, I started painting this last evening. This guy, and let's just continue. Something is glitching. See the latency. It's okay now, I guess. Or not. Look. Why is everything lagging? What the fuck? And it's always when I start, it seems to lag, and then it like releases, you know. The fuck. Some stupid process. Which one? I don't have a fucking clue. This theme sounds nice. Yay, man. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for coming by and saying hi. Respect.
cleared the tower. Every core computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
And we are back, dressed like a bro, to talk about book cope, specifically blog cope, on the subject of the origins and history of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Now, I'm going to give you a run through about what the hypothesis of this book. This is basically a book review, a cope review. This is, you could say, bio-sanctioned cope that is permitted and you are allowed to read, you're allowed to listen to. If I am to get Catholic and suggest that you do not read the book ever, I may permit you to read this, or at the very least, you can sit down here for the next 40 minutes and listen to me tell you what the book says. Maybe don't even read it yourself. Just trust me that I will lead you properly through it. So, according to Julian Jaynes, the writer of this magnificent work of book cope, he comes up with this daring hypothesis that man had no consciousness until 1000 BC. He basically said we didn't really think for ourselves. We were, as we might understand animals, pulled around by our instincts and pulled around by forces that are not self-aware and just sort of driven in the way that we orientate this. And he bases this decision off a litany of different things: neuroscience, the neuroscience of his day in the 70s, and literature, and a kind of combination of all these. He does a very right hemispheric job where he collages a holistic picture of all these different possibilities to come up with a perspective, which is what the hypothesis is, a perspective and a way of looking at things. And he offers it to us to take this hypothesis and run with it and see, can it be broken, or is there maybe anything to it in some type of way? Now, he proposes that man had no consciousness until 1000 BC, and before that time, language had developed slowly for a long period of time. So language and consciousness were tied, of course they were. And what had begun initially from language is that we used to get commands, we used to get spoken to, we used to have voices speak to us, which we understood as the gods, and then over time this evolved into giving us nouns, so the operant conceptions of things, and then names, which is where we get specific idiosyncratic names of things in that type of regard. And that was 10,000 BC. So we went from 40,000 BC, where we were like hearing something, and this was evolving slowly into articulate language as we understood. In the beginning, there was the word, and then it turned into more complicated things. At the time of the emergence of agriculture, language and at the time of the emergence of agriculture in 10,000 BC, I read book cope so little, I struggle to put together the syntax of these sentences. Now, he says that language, the speech areas of language, evolved in the left hemisphere in right-handed people, which is something that I've talked about an awful lot. We call it specifically the Broca's area, that is the external speech area, and then you have a Wernicke's area, which is at the back, and this is to do with your ability to process language. If you get hit in the head and you're hit on the left back of your head, you might lose the ability to understand what people say, but you'll be well able to speak, which would make you very annoying to be around. On the other hand, you could lose the front, where you could understand people and not be able to speak, which would just be very annoying to be around people. So both are a pretty bad deal. And as we understand this, we see this in modern neuroscience. We see it in the brain as it is. We see the hemispheres split in half. But Jaynes notices that there's a bit of a mystery, because most human structures are bilateral. Like, you have two hands and they do different jobs, but they're kind of, they're paired. They're two hands in this type of regard. And what's interesting is that the right hemisphere has the possibility of creating language. It has an area on the opposite side of the head which could make language if it wanted to. It's got these structures in place, but we don't really know what it does. It's like that problem you see with DNA, where people say, for example, we have like millions of digits of junk DNA, like 80% of our DNA, 70% of our DNA is like shared with a banana, and we don't know what it does. Some genius scientists, like, this is the type of stuff they get up to in academia. They're sitting around there being like, oh yeah, we're 80% bananas, and I don't know what any of this stuff is for. It's like, great job, man. Wow, you're just on the cutting edge science, man. Experts, man. But they don't know what it does, and it's sort of similar with stuff like the right hemisphere. Like, there's parts of the right hemisphere that we can sort of guess has some type of association with the thing on the left, and opposite way around, but we don't really know exactly what's going on. And so Jaynes proposes that the bicameral mind, so bicameral means two cameras, two you could say chasms, if you want to think about it this way. Two cameras a man operated between 10,000 BC and 1000 BC. So what a bicameral mind means is that basically the two hemispheres were actually interacting with each other, and they would work together to create and move and order and command and talk to the human that they were controlling, if you want to think about it this way. And that during that period, the left hemisphere was the site for speech and the right was the site for hallucinations, or expressed voices and commands of gods and demons. Now, that sounds pretty fucking radical, but when you read through literature, so for example the Homeric myths or the Bible, you read through books from back in the day, and you know this, like you've heard Richard Dawkins talk about this. It's like, oh, you know, are we really going to listen to a load of like religious idiots who are just like schizophrenics running around looking at bushes, hearing voices? Like, you've heard the dismissal of Christianity and stuff like that with this. Well, this is actually, like, he's not lying. This is literally what you see in these past these past stories and whatnot. You see a character like Joshua or Moses or whoever, like all of them, even in the Homeric myths as well. You see Achilles and all this, and they're running around doing their thing, killing people and stuff like this, but they're getting commands. They're getting spoken to. There's forces coming up, the god, like Yahweh, or the gods, or Athena in Achilles' case, and they're literally hearing things and hallucinating things. They're literally experiencing these otherworldly forces that are driving them towards operant and behaviors. And they can also speak. Like, to give you a breakdown that I've talked about before, a very famous scene from the Iliad is Achilles is standing in front of Agamemnon, and he's standing there, and Agamemnon basically says, I'm going to take your girl and have a bath with her, and I'm going to, like, you know, get her to rub me and all this type of stuff. And Achilles, being a bro, is like, no, you can't do that. No, definitely not. And Achilles wants to kill him, and he, you know, is going to grab his sword and cut his head off and put down his arrogance and all this. But as that's happening, this thing appears. The Greeks understood it as the god Athena. You could say the abstract archetype of wisdom appeared to him, but that's not really what's going on. When you read the book about what it says, it's like, no, Athena jumped down and grabbed his yellow hair and pulled it back, grabbed his hair and pulled it backwards and said to him, no, calm down, wait, hold on a second. That's not what you shouldn't do this. It's basically like the sort of operant voice of his conscience. And he sees Athena, and it says in the feckin' script, only Achilles could see Athena, and she started talking to him. And then Achilles, as himself, as, you know, Achilles, began to speak to Agamemnon and explain to him what's going on in this type of regard. So he had the god show up to him, the goddess show up to him and speak to him. And well, this is a very difficult problem, because a lot of people read through this and be like, oh, they were just being poetic, you know, they're just being metaphorical. Yeah, they were just sort of using an allegory for the archetype of wisdom or something like that. And maybe that's true. But this piece of work comes from this period of time between 10,000 BC and 1000 BC. It comes from this period of time where when you read through this stuff, there's gods and goddesses and fairies and all this stuff going on. And it's actually difficult for us to understand. And so what Julian suggests is that this actually might literally be the right hemisphere. It's like, oh, here we go, Steph. You know, you never read any book, Cope, unless there's literally the hemispheres in it, and then you're just like all for it and all this type of stuff. But it's interesting stuff nonetheless. And this is why I go for it. I am bought in. I am in a dogma. I am in my cognitive dissonance blocks out any other possibilities. I'm just firmly like, right, if it has hemispheres, it's tolerable. If it does not, I just ignore it. I just categorize it as book, Cope, to avoid having to think differently about my perspective and worldview. So what Julian proposes is that this relationship going on between these two forces is the right hemisphere speaking to the left hemisphere. So you see Achilles, and Achilles' experience of life was constant schizophrenic hallucinations, constant hearing voices. You know that sort of definition of like, oh, hey, I'm hearing voices inside my head and they're not my own. It's like, bro, you've got schizophrenia. Go off to the madhouse there. We're done with you. Achilles' normal life was like that. He was just walking around and hearing all this stuff. And in the Bible, you know, Moses' normal life was like this. Joshua's normal life was like this. It's not like that Richard Dawkins is wrong. It's like these people were all schizophrenics. But the kind of problem is that everybody back then was schizophrenic. There was this evolutionary stage that we are in where everybody was schizo. Everybody was crazy. And what do we mean by schizophrenic? In that they were hearing hallucinations and voices, and they're listening to them and doing what they told them. They're taking them serious. They were hearing external and outside forces that were speaking to them, and they were allowing them to coordinate them along. And again, the more that we've gone forward in history, the more James has actually, his things become validated, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. So the breakdown of the bicameral mind was, according to James, caused by a weakening of the auditory by the advent of writing. So basically, book cope comes along, writing comes along, script cope, and feather quill cope, pen cope, whatever you want to call it. People started to get like all neurotic, and they're like, yeah, I want to like bend over like Gollum and just start scribbling and scribbling and scribbling. And that was essentially the ascendancy, the revolt of the left hemisphere, as Nietzsche might see it, the revolt of the slave, the revolt of the left hemisphere, the revolt of the emissary pulls man's head out of the vision and beautiful world of God and pulls us down into these stone tablets, has us etched as crap onto these pages, these silly, stupid squiggles, and have us hallucinate onto these stone tablets, and then eventually parchments and papyrus and pages, and eventually that bends us over until it morphs into this tiny little iPhone, and then we're stuck being a modern bug man, a modern last man, and a modern book cope nogginist neurotic stuck in your head, unable to listen to your hallucinations. Basically, the advent of writing ruined us. The advent of writing was the greatest mistake. The ultimate revolution of the plebeian mind came through the advent of writing and killed off the bicameral mind. It killed the gods. God died because of writing. That was the expressed and explicit problem which happened. And this weakening of the auditory experience of the world, basically you can look at it like how things are now. Like, I way prefer listening to podcasts, listening to books as opposed to reading them. And there was a time in prehistory where everything was oral and everything was listened to as opposed to spoke. And of course, when you listen to something, when you develop that competence and that sensitivity to that realm of senses, which is the auditory, you would obviously begin to be more attentive in general. And as you do this, you would be more aware of what's going on inside your head, and maybe you're more entranced then by the bicameral mind, by the voice inside your head, the auditory hallucinations that were happening. But when you start writing, you start to zone in and favor the left hemisphere's realm of hyper reality, which is the book cope, and then go along with this. So he says the advent of writing was a big one. The inherent fragility of hallucinating control. So basically, like, as cool as it is to be ordered around by the right hemisphere or maybe the gods or whatever it is, it's not exactly going to work in the long run with consciousness. Consciousness is able to make its own decisions, and there was always going to be a breakdown of this type of mind. There was always going to be a fall of man into the realm of self-awareness. The unworkableness of gods and the chaos of historical upheaval. So an awful lot of what happened in 10,000 BC was basically a fall of Rome moment. We call it, I think, the rise of the sea people, the great civilizational collapse of the sea people. So there was sort of, you can read it in lots of different examples. Basically, Egypt got taken over by a load of Vikings, is the only way they understand it. And this chaos may have actually destroyed and challenged a lot of these problems. And obviously, there's another thing as well, which came out recently, which is not talked about here, which is that the Ian McGilchrist talks about this. Basically, your bicameral brain, your two hemispheres, this is present in all the animals. And what's interesting is that the animals' hemispheres are more tightly connected, if you want to think about it this way, or maybe they work as a team more closely. And as we've evolved out of being birds, we didn't evolve out of birds, but being mammals, and into higher mammals and higher beings, and into primates, and then eventually into humans, what happens is the brains lateralize more. Maybe we could implicitly say the higher up in evolution we go, or the more advanced we go, or the closer we go towards advanced intelligence, the more that the brain lateralizes, splits in half, and develops a dual approach to what it's doing in the world. So the brain is pulling itself apart, splitting itself apart, and turning into two powers, and separating themselves out, like the way that man and woman separates out in order to do a unified job of raising a family or creating a child or succeeding in the world or something like this. The same happens with your brain. Your brain gradually lateralizes more and specializes more and works as a team and covers its opposites in this type of regard. Very Jungian idea going on here. And so what's sort of happening evolutionarily is that since we've gone from monkeys, our brains have lateralized more, and maybe there was this period where all of this was actually actively happening. Maybe it's still happening now. There's actually decent evidence I can't remember the book cope that it came from, but there was a study where they discovered that people in the Amazon, for example, have more unified brains than anybody who is under Christianity or the Christian church, because the Christian church, and I think Judaism as well, the Christian church and Judaism, they're very, very heavy on reading, and I'm not sure, maybe it included Islam too, but nonetheless, these are religions of the book, and they're very heavy on reading. And so, like, most people in Europe tend to have very strong left hemispheric approaches to things, and people with even European ancestry have this as well, which is a fascinating thing to discover. And so there's obviously upsides and downsides to this, and they sort of suggest that maybe quite a lot of this stuff was maybe even trained in recent years, since the advent of the printing press and all this type of stuff, and we've actually epigenetically or genetically basically evolved to be even more lateralized, even more left hemisphere than we thought before. And this is a sort of historic process that was happening. And so maybe this window between 10,000 BC and 1000 BC was the strengthening and lateralizing and specializing of the left hemisphere that created what we understand as modern consciousness. And then, of course, it was at that point where it hadn't fully broken away from the right hemisphere. And so the two of them were sort of holding on to each other, and we were becoming aware and becoming self-aware, and the left hemisphere is beginning to understand itself as an ego. But still at the same time, there was still the right hemisphere shouting across the hall at it, saying like, hey, do this, do that, do this. And so a lot of the early writing, just as we're beginning to go into full left hemisphere mode, Gollum mode, book cope mode, we start writing and all this stuff, the bridge is still attached. And so all of our early writing is full of these people walking around in the world where they're like hearing stuff all the time. And then we read back over our early writing and be like, what the fuck was going on back then? That's crazy. These people are nuts, man. Thank God we're so modern. Thank God we're in such a good place. So there's a big idea there, and I think there's actually decent evidence to back it up, and it's definitely worth exploring. Let's put it this type of way. And so he says, yes, the unworkableness of the gods and the chaos of historic upheaval and the positioning of internal cause and the observation of differences in others. I don't know what that means. I'm not going to go into that. And a modicum of natural selection. So, and then consciousness and self-awareness evolved and hopefully still does. So basically consciousness took over. So the left hemisphere revolted. It specialized and it became aware of itself. And all of a sudden it lost the run of itself and said, I'm going to become conscious. And then we developed the institution of consciousness, and it evolved more and more strongly. And eventually we lost the auditory hallucinations, and maybe the right hemisphere began to drop that. Like in all things, when it's not used, nature will conserve it, but you often like kind of let it drop out, or like your appendix, you know, you can kind of think about it this way. Nature just sort of said, fuck it, we don't need the command hallucinations anymore. It deprioritized it. And so a lot of the structures still sit there in your brain, but we just don't really use them anymore. And this is why like we can sit through the gods and read through the gods and see all this stuff and be like, oh, that's really, really strange. And then we have people like schizophrenics, we have people who hallucinate, we take a load of LSD and we have these hallucinations, and maybe these institutions all switch back on and we see the gods again and we see the world the way these ancients were. But we understand this as an exceptional thing, as a outside the thing, a non-normal thing, if you will. But that's us sort of jogging through these old institutions, these old parts of our brains that are still there. They just don't really have a kind of direct function anymore, which is a really interesting idea. Now, there's quite a lot of stuff. I'm actually going to click over to some different blog cope here, because a huge amount, since Julian proposed this, actually, you know what? I'm going to read the book cope. Are you down? Let's read the book cope. Okay. Beginning in 1999, research began to emerge confirming Julian James's neurological model for the bicameral mind. fMRI studies showed a right-left temporal lobe interaction during auditory verbal hallucinations. Yet, more than 20 years later, there remains ongoing confusion on this subject, as evidenced by recent blog copers. To help clear up this lingering confusion, I revisit this topic with an excerpt from one of my related newsletter articles. All right, here, now calm down now, pitch in your newsletter. Jesus, now. Marcel Kujestern. Easy there now. Followed by further reading quotes from related research video and additional resources. So, here we go. Over 3 decades ago, Julian James introduced this theory as the origin of consciousness and historically older mentality called the bicameral mind. So the bicameral mind is about that little window between 10,000 BC and 1000 BC where everybody was running around hearing, seeing the gods, and that was actually the right hemisphere dressing itself up like a bro. Pity there's no bro gods. So while the technology was not available to test his ideas, James suggested a possible neurological model for the bicameral mind. Briefly stated, he reasoned that the auditory hallucinations emanate from areas of the right temporal lobe corresponding to the language areas in the left temporal lobe. So that's what I was talking about earlier, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and then the other structures over on this side that seem like they could be suitable for this. Because of this external quality, the bicameral person experiences auditory hallucinations interpreted to them as externally generated commands of a dead ancestor, a chief, a king, or a god. So you might have heard people talk about like, oh, the ancestors were speaking to me, or the pagans would talk about the ancestors, ancestor worship. And you look at some things, Terence McKenna would be exploring old religions, and he would see that oftentimes when they take psychedelics, they talk about meeting the dead people, which is their family, and the dead people talk to them and teach them stuff. Chiefs, kings, the ancient god, the ancient chief. Like Odin was apparently originally, according to the Norse, a tribal leader. He was a big, profound tribal warrior, a band warrior. Maybe he was actually a real person who then over time got mythologized. Like people often talk about stuff like this. And then of course the concept of gods. So Athena, Yahweh in the Bible and all this stuff. Now, to this day, those who experience auditory hallucinations often hear behavioral commands and experience them as being externally generated. So this is quite a common thing in schizophrenia. You hear voices, like as I said before, it's like, hey, bro, something's telling me to hurt people. And you're like, whoa, what is going on? And then they send you and they drug the fuck out of you so that doesn't happen anymore. And you kind of wonder about that because you listen to, for example, Joshua in the Bible, and he shows up outside Jericho, and basically God says to him, go into Jericho and hurt everyone. Go into Jericho and destroy Jericho. And you're kind of thinking, Richard Dawkins reads that and be like, he was a psychopathic schizophrenic who was taking advice from a jealous, evil, tyrannical God and all this stuff. And you're like, all right, Richard. But when you kind of think about it, maybe there's something like this going on. So, consciousness in the bicameral mind, there's a collection of neuroimaging studies, so they analyze the brain, that have emerged over the past decade that provide support for Jane's neurological model. These studies show brain activation in the right, followed by the left temporal lobe at the onset of auditory hallucination. So basically, when people hear stuff, basically the right hemisphere temporal lobe, the right side of the right hemisphere, just around about your ear, switches on, and then the left hemisphere switches on just a fraction of a second afterwards, sort of inferring that the left hemisphere is listening to what this is said over here. So it's like, bing, hello, yes, what? So it's like create and then listen. And some researchers infer a possible interaction between these two areas, the language areas of the left hemisphere and the corresponding areas of the right hemisphere during auditory hallucinations. A French psychiatrist called René Jaldi and his colleagues published a study in molecular psychology titled Activation of Bilateral Auditory Cortex During Verbal Hallucinations in a Child with Schizophrenia. They used the MRI to study the neural substrates of auditory hallucinations in children suffering from very early onset schizophrenia. God, the book copers, man. He's just say it. Just say the thing I want to hear. Give me the dramatic marketing line. Give me the big bang line. Just be like, Steph was right. Why don't we just write? I'll write to Marcel here and I'll be like, just delete your feckin' little blog cope here and just write Steph was right. All right. That's all I want to hear. And if you want to do more formally, be like Ian McGilchrist and Steph was right. You can do that if you wish. The analysis performed shows that the bilateral activation of the superior temporal gyri during auditory hallucinations, this bilateral activation of the superior temporal is exactly what James predicted more than 30 years ago. And this is the picture of it, okay? So here you have the right and the left, and they see this side switch on and this other side switch on at the same time. Now, to give you a kind of breakdown on what exactly this is, so they study schizophrenics, people who hear voices, and when the person, they put on a thing on their head and they analyze them, and when the person says, oh, I'm hearing a voice now, what you hear is like a voice outside of you. This is often the experience people describe, like an external voice, someone else's voice, the voices, or something like this, something speaking to them, and this is different than the voice in your head where you're sort of sitting there and being like, God, I fucking hate book cope, and maybe that's my voice, and they jog in their mind and talk about all this type of stuff, and that's different than what these people hear when they hear something else, like someone else's voice, an external thing. And what they analyze in these studies is they see that when the person says, oh, it's happening, I'm hearing the voice, the right hemisphere switches on. The right hemisphere is doing something in this specific place, which is the language centers. And the left hemisphere is doing something that looks an awful lot like listening to them. And this is freaky because this means, they see this. They see, all right, you're hearing the voice and then boom, the brain is doing this. Specifically showing that in modern schizophrenics, people nowadays, they hear voices and it looks like the right hemisphere is the voice that they hear, or it's involved in the process in some type of way, which is verifying what Julian was suggesting and making Steph right. So in an article published in 2007 in Schizophrenia Research, Dr. Iris E. Sommer and her colleagues in Netherlands reported that the majority of schizophrenia patients showed prominent activity in the right-sided homunculus of the classical language areas during auditory verbal hallucinations. while normal language is generally produced by the left hemisphere in right-handed subjects. Again, corresponding precisely with Steph's predictions. In another study in 2008, Sommer measured cerebral activity using MRIs in 24 psychotic patients. They reported that group analysis for auditory verbal hallucinations revealed activations in the right homogula of the Broca's area, bilateral insula, bilateral supramarginal gyri, and right superior temporal gyrus. And they go on to speculate that the association between audio verbal hallucinations and activity in the right hemisphere language area could explain the low linguistic complexity and derogatory content characteristic for auditory hallucinations in psychotic patients. So, God, apologies about the jargon. Let's put it that way. Apologies, but this is how scientists, this is how sophisticated intellectuals talk to each other, actually. So maybe I should sort of say, maybe you're too much of a peasant to understand all this brain blather that we're talking about. But basically, I'll break it down for you. I'll explain to you what happens. If you want it in the simplest way possible, the crudest psychotic command hallucination, Steph was right. Always believe Steph. That's sort of what they're saying in a long-winded way. But on a simple way, they're talking about the nature of command hallucinations tend to be very blunt and crude and derogatory and straightforward. You know, they're not sophisticated. They don't come up with these elaborate long syntax sentences. And what this is sort of like is you hear people it'll be like, shut up, or do this or do that. It's very like command. Bang, bang, bang. Now, that's actually quite interesting, again, with the two hemispheres, because the left hemisphere, and this is what Jordan Peterson talks about, is specified towards detail. So you have your right hand for, holding your pen and writing stuff like that out. It's detail-orientated. Also, language for your right hand, which is your left hemisphere, is connected for these little small detail things. Whereas the right hemisphere and the left hand, it's generalized. So, for example, when you open a jar with your left hand. If you're right-handed, you open it with your left hand because it's a big process, generalized movement. It's not a little small detailed movement. So it's geared in this type of way. This is the difference between the two. It's actually quite interesting. And so, for example, the right hemisphere tends to be more broad, generalized, crude, not specific, whereas the left hemisphere is specific, detail orientated, and all these type of things. Now, when you have a psychosis and you start hearing hallucinations, interestingly, there's low linguistic complexity and derogatory content to it, and crudeness and bluntness in that type of way. It's command, it's simple, it's punched, it's to the point, these type of things. Again, sort of going with one of those associations, carrying many of the characteristics that we understand before. Very, very interesting thing again. And then lastly, in a 2008 article titled Functional MRI of Verbal Self-Monitoring and Schizophrenia, published in Schizophrenia Bulletin, psychologist Veena Kumari and her colleagues in the United Kingdom concluded that positive schizophrenic symptoms, hallucinations and persecution show exaggerated activation in the right superior middle temporal gyrus. Oh dear, and then there's more. Look, Marcel, thank you very much for the blog. Thank you very much for your lovely blog. But I'm going to stop with the book cope there before we all melt. Our faces just melt off. I'm going to email Marcel and tell him how we're going to do things more. I'm just basically going to say clickbait, bro. You've got to cut out all this jargon, all this talk, all this book cope. Give it to people what they want. Clickbait, right hemisphere. Madness is cool. Like something like this. We'll go with simpler titles like this. This will be our new marketing agency that we'll set up in this regard. Now, making all this stuff practical is always a bit of an issue. It's fun to speculate. Even Richard Dawkins read this stuff and he was sort of saying, Julian's either an idiot or a genius, but to hell with it. It's actually kind of fun to just think this through, explore, ponder, pontificate, hypothesize. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing dangerous about it. This is probably the worst about the people who give out about this stuff. The jargonites, the nogginists, they're like, you can't imagine, you can't think, no, you can't speculate, don't ever speculate. Well, when you're good at speculating, it's actually quite a lot of joy. But it's very, very hard to get this stuff really into something that's useful. Like, what the hell do I care? What are you telling me, Steph? Like, I should literally go schizophrenic. Like, thanks. Wow, really helpful. Me trying to improve myself, work on my habits and become a better person. And you're like, just go schizo, to go psychotic. I don't know. Maybe don't be normal probably wouldn't be bad advice, but I don't know. Should I go that extreme? Should I be start listening to command hallucinations? It's a bit far. Maybe I'm sort of grooming you for a cult where I'll sort of be like, and let my voice be the command hallucination. Let me be the chief. Let me be the god, and I will order you around. You just listen to the command hallucination. I actually quite like where this stuff is going. I'm building up a neuroscientific cult. It's like Scientology part 2, Boyotology, something like this. So making this stuff practical is a big deal. Now, when I learned quite a lot of this stuff, and I've been working with people in the Boyo program and whatnot. Yes, this is another 40-minute pitch. Believe me, right? Tighten your seatbelt. Here we go for the 40-minute pitch. Another 40-minute pitch coming your way. When I'm working with people in the Boyo program, I would do stuff sort of in the psychological game, because people are trying to work with their minds to get more out of themselves, to develop themselves. Like, it's obviously the goal that most people have. I want to be a better person. I want to be in a better position. I want to be in better shape. I want to have better habits. I want to use my mind better. I want to get more creativity. I want to speak better. All these type of things. And oftentimes people want to relate to themselves better and work with their emotions better, because, for example, the thing that tortures you the most is fundamentally your emotions. It doesn't matter if you have $1 million. If your emotions, if your guilt, if your shame, your fear, your anxiety, whatever it is torturing you, well, there's your problem. And that's the really big deal. And so people come to me and be like, help me deal with these emotions, help me take these forces, these emotions, these gods that are attacking me, and help me externalize them and turn them into something creative that I can project onto the world and shoot out into the world. How do I do this? Is this possible? What is this? I feel that I need to learn something about this stuff. And I would get people on board and I'd sit them down. And a problem I often have is that I would have very little patience for jargonizing. I'd have very little patience for nogginism. I'd have very little patience for people who have, spent hours on the internet, maybe decades on the internet, self-diagnosing, reading blog cope, reading books and all this type of stuff, associating this and categorizing all this stuff, and dueling, putting all these posted stamps on the inside of their minds and coming up with all these names, or anima integration, or archetype of this, or all these type of things. They live a sort of fake reality, a jargonized reality. It doesn't even matter if it's a Jungian. It can be whatever you so wish. Like, it'll come in all sorts of different ways. It's self-diagnosed and often badly done, if you will. And the problem I would have with that is that it's very hard to have a real experience with someone. And for example, if someone comes to you and they want to work with themselves, your big problem is that you need to get them back to an authentic experience with themselves. Because the reality is that your instincts and your emotions know more than me. I'm just a fucking boyo who talks shit and reads book coping and makes fun of it. Like, who the hell am I? Why are you listening to me? I'm literally a clown. Like, it's stupid. Like, what am I doing? My job doesn't make any sense. Like, why are you here? What's going on? But the thing you're looking for is not necessarily me, although come on to the Boyo program, but this is the worst pitch ever. It's not necessarily me. What you're looking for is you're looking for your instincts. You're looking for yourself. You're looking for what is internalized in you, your psychology, the voices and the impact in you. Your gut knows what you need to do. Your conscience knows what you need to do. You need to stand up to that person. You need to make a decision based on this thing. You need to say no and actually draw a boundary. You need to get serious and start changing that habit. Like, in some sense, your instincts know when you're walking down the street and your instincts say, that girl, talk to her, please. I need this. This is what I want. This is what I want. It gives you a very clear feeling of what you want. It pushes you in this type of way. And it's not obscure. It's not strange. It's just that you're a fucking bitch and you're afraid to listen to it. You're actually scared of it. And you come up with rationalizations to avoid listening to the stuff in your body that's ancient and already there. The instincts, the gods, the emotions, whatever you want to call it. The unconscious, if you want to dress it up. Yes, we can call it that. The unconscious instincts that are waiting to drive you. And they appear when you're around certain things. When that person says the wrong thing to you and you should stand up and say no, you feel that, but you would deny that because you were afraid of letting that out, because that will force you into a confrontation and all this stuff. And so my challenge is always trying to get people with these authentic relationships with their emotions, and oftentimes their past, the guilt they have from their past, the abuse they might have had in their past. You might call it trauma from the past or something like that. When that's real, most of the time it's not as real as people make it out to be. And it's very easy for me to say, come on to the Boyo program and fix your trauma, but really, like, people's traumas is not as serious as they make it out to be in my experience. Nonetheless, it's stuff like that can be there. There can be an experience from the past that you need to deal with or something like this, and you need to sit down and confront it. You need to sit down and go and listen to it, and your gut will show you. You can literally just listen to your body, and your body will show you, oh yeah, you need to deal with this. This is the thing you need to focus on. And so in my experience, I would get people in, and there's this wall and cloud of rationalizations that are just in the way, a fog, and you're like trying to break your way through it. And I was never like, I would be like, we don't need to deal with this. This isn't the problem. This isn't authentic. This is the wrong place. We're not looking in the right place here at all. What we need to do is get you back in touch with the instincts, the felt experience of the body. And I would actually understand it a little bit like the left brain has run along here and created an elaborate cope rationalization that's acting as a giant inflated egotistical palace of bullshit that the person can avoid, whereas they need to get back into the instinctive felt experience of their body. And maybe I'd use the language of like get into the right hemisphere, although I don't like to categorize it too much because I don't know exactly what it is. But nonetheless, I knew on first principle that's what you need to do. It's axiomatic. You need to get back to that more authentic experience and learn how to listen to this. And so, for example, over time, one exercise I developed that I work with people quite a lot, I call it the catharsis meditation, was about sitting someone down when they come in and they're like, oh, I want to talk about the nogginism. It's like, no, you don't. No, you don't. Sit down. All right. I want you to get into the body. I want you to, all right, literally do this one thing. Ignore your categorizations. Ignore your rationalizations. I want you to push the left brain out of the way. We want to make fun of it. We want to ignore all this stuff. And when we talk about your feelings or your emotions, push that stuff away, ignore that, and tell me the true sensations, the actual experience of your body. For example, a very simple one that a lot of people understand is desire, right? So you see a beautiful girl. What do you feel? What actually happens? You might say, I want her, or I'm scared, or the voice in my head says this, but that's not what actually happens. What happens is you get this like tightness maybe in your belly that shoots up. That's, cortisol rushing through your body into your chest, and it makes your breath get shallow, and then you kind of get a little bit hot. That's the actual experience. That's the real felt experience. And when you get someone to pay attention to this and go out into the world and see this experience popping up, you can sort of say to them, that's what fills up that category of that emotion of lust, if you want to say this, or desire or want or something like that. That's what it is. The actual real authentic experience is that burst of what we might understand as cortisol, but it's this burst of bodily experiences and sensations. And that's the real experience. And your job is to develop a relationship with that, because it's all good in theory for you to be pious and you to know stuff, but if you can't manage that emotion in real time and perform despite feeling that way and interpret it correctly, understand that that's not necessarily your body trying to call you a bitch and make you a coward. It's your body trying to warm you up so that you've got loads of adrenaline pumping through your veins, so you're aware. So when you talk to the girl, you're not walking up and being like blah, 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 blah. You're actually saying something that's coherent and all this stuff. This is your body warming itself up for performance. It's a god showing up. It's a force, an unconscious force that shows
Okay, I'm back. Sorry, had to grab one apple. I'm hungry. Mm. Nah. What? No. Yeah, I think I'm finished for now. Maybe I'll come later this evening. So, see you around, folks.